What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in this episode of Sonar Fishing, I'm going to talk about bank fishing. We're going to talk about some of the baits that are going to help you catch more fish from the bank, okay? Because I get wrapped up fishing for my bass boat, you know, my Phoenix bass boat all the time. That's where I love to be, is on that boat. But something that is near and dear to my heart is just fishing from the bank, man. You know, going to a small farm pond or golf course ponds, you know, anywhere, and just fishing from the bank. You know, it's still just ingrained in me from when I first started bass fishing. And so I want to share with you some of the baits that I really like to lean on in the hard bait category, because we've already talked about my favorite baits overall for bank fishing in the past. And most of those baits really revolve around you know, weedless presentation. So Texas rigging, you know, throwing just a basic weightless, you know, stick bait is a really big deal, or a actual weighted Texas rig with like some type of swimming worm like the turbo fatties. Those are all some of my favorites because they're very versatile. You can fish them in and around cover, open water, however you want to fish them. Another one is a chatterbait. A chatterbait is always a big deal. But I ended up getting a question from Robert, who is a longtime viewer, and he asks about hard baits specifically for bank fishing. And you know, I kind of neglect to you know, lump some hard baits in my bank fishing arsenal, and the reason for that is because there's a lot of opportunities for snagging when you're bank fishing, but there are many situations where a hard bait is going to be advantageous for you and can get you those bites that you otherwise wouldn't get. And so I'm going to go through some of my favorite hard baits, and really you're going to notice a couple things. First off, these are baits that generally are a little bit shallower or more top water, and then also they're baits that are a little bit more buoyant. Obviously the top water ones are going to be very buoyant, but the other ones that are subsurface or just slightly below the surface are also buoyant. And the reason for that is because when you're fishing from the bank, your casting angles are somewhat limited sometimes, and you want to make sure that you've got baits that can come out of cover fairly well. And I'm also, another note on this video is when I'm talking about hard baits, I'm talking about like crankbaits or top water baits with treble hooks, you know, those sort of baits. I'm not talking about you know, wire baits like spinner baits or chatter baits or jigs. Those, we're kind of leaving those out. So and the reason for that is because I can do a whole other video on, you know, jigs, chatter baits, spinner baits, buzz baits, and those are all really good bank fishing techniques. In fact, all of those that I just mentioned, you can fish from the bank fairly regularly. But I never talk about hard baits fishing from the bank. So let's go ahead and do this. Thank you, Robert, for the question. The very first bait, we're going to start with kind of the deepest baits that I like to throw from the bank, and then kind of work our way up, you know, to the top water category. So the first one has got to be some type of square bill crankbait. Okay, square bill crankbait. This right here is the Strike King 1.5. You know, a 2.5 is also in this category, and then there's a lot of wood baits too. So this right here is a plastic bait. You know, the 1.5 is plastic. This one right here, you can see this one has caught a lot of fish. It's been very well used. It's been grinding into all kinds of cover for many years now. But you know, a shallow diving crankbait with a square bill is really a killer bait off the bank, especially when you've got wood and you know, rock. You know, if you've got a lot of wood and rock where you're going to be casting, a square bill like this is going to be great. It usually dives down between, you know, 3 and 5 foot, depending on how far you can cast it and the type of line that you're using. And that's perfect for bank fishing because as opposed to fishing from from a boat, if fishing from a boat, you want a bait that'll actually get down deeper in general, because you're casting up shallow in a lot of situations, and you're bringing it to deeper water. And so a deeper diving bait is actually going to snag less, fishing from a boat as it is from the shore, because shore you're going out deep and bringing it shallow, and by the time you get closer to the shoreline, this is going to be at its maximum depth, and if you're using a deeper diving crankbait, it's probably going to snag a lot more. So a bait like this 1.5 has high buoyancy, so it's going to allow you to make contact with cover, and then it'll float away, and so that helps you kind of maintain a more snag-free presentation, and also just the fact that the bill, it has a squared shape to it, is also going to help with that snag-free kind of quality of these baits, okay, because it deflects off of cover very well, comes in contact with cover and kind of bounces off, which is exactly what you want. So a square bill crankbait has got to be one of my favorite bank fishing baits. Again, it's not as good for fishing around vegetation. You can fish it around vegetation. I don't think it's one of my first choices around a grass lake. Again, I'm probably going to be really leaning on something that's more weedless, like a chatterbait, or fishing a Texas rig, something around those lines. But if you're fishing, say you're fishing like the dam portion of a lake where there's a lot of riprap, or maybe an occasional like stump or lay down or something like that, a square bill crankbait is actually going to be probably one of the best tools that you can use in that type of scenario. So that's one of my first ones, but just keep in mind that you want a bait that is very buoyant. You're going to get very frustrated when you use a crankbait or any bait that has near neutral buoyancy, because it's just not going to have the power, the buoyancy to back away from the cover, and you're going to snag more. So make sure whatever crankbait you're using has good buoyancy. But definitely a 1.5 or your favorite square bill is going to be a really, really good bank fishing bait. All right, so going up the water column, we've only got two baits that I really like to use as far as hard baits on bank fishing situations. The next one is another crankbait that has a very, very small bill. So this one right here, this is what I consider a wake bait. It's got a very tiny lip on it, okay, and the lip protrudes almost vertical, almost a 90 degree, but this one's a little bit less than 90 degrees. And this bait is highly buoyant. It's just designed to be right subsurface. In fact, as you're reeling it, if you're using the right type of line and all that, it'll probably make a nice little wake motion on the surface. So it'll just barely create a bulge on the surface, an S-shape pattern in the water. And this bait right here, this is a storm subwort. So, a lot of people call them wiggleworts, but I call wiggleworts the ones that have the longer bill. The subwort, I don't even know if they sell this one anymore, but I've caught so many fish off of this little crankbait. And again, it's just made to go just slightly below the surface, and oftentimes it's going to be creating that waking motion. But this is a really, really good bank fishing hard bait, and the reason for that is because it's buoyant. It's not going to be diving too deep, so whatever you're casting it at, you can see when, if you're going to be snagging, with deeper diving crankbaits, you might run into a stump or a type of, some type of debris that is going to hang your crankbait. But with a wake bait, you pretty much know exactly what you're dealing with on the surface, or at least you should. And so it's a really good bait to cast around you know, certain types of cover that maybe are below the surface, you know, further than this will dive to. And it's also a really good choice if you have grass that is growing up within, you know, a half a foot of the surface, a foot of the surface. It's not going to dive into that grass, but that's the point. You're trying to draw fish up out of that grass to hit this bait, and it's not going to snag into that grass if it's not reaching the surface. So this is a really good one for, like, you know, golf course ponds or any pond that has submergent vegetation that's not growing all the way to the surface. Has a little bit of a rattle. It does make a good amount of sound, and one thing I will mention about a wake bait like this is I really like to fish it around the bluegill spawn. The bluegill spawn, this is a bait that is just forgotten, and I think that's a mistake because this is one of the best little bluegill imitators out there, and I can mop up with this bait fishing around the bluegill spawn, which, you know, is very easy to fish and identify on small ponds because those bluegill are making those like honeycomb shaped, you know, congregations of beds, you know, near the bank, and this is a really good one to pick up and cast over and around those bluegill beds. So those are the two subsurface baits that I really like to throw. A 1.5 crankbait and a wake bait like this. There's a lot of different companies that make these wake baits. I know Storm still makes a new one that I think Brandon Polinick helped design. It's the Arashi one, but there's a bunch of them out there. Not as many as other categories of crankbaits, which I think is a big mistake because you know, these wake baits just kill it in certain situations. But now let's get into more topwater, because when I think of bank fishing and using hard baits, I think topwater is the one exception to using hard baits, you know, fishing from the bank. I like to use hard baits quite a bit, especially if there's not a ton of dense matted out grass or just, you know, lily pads or emergent vegetation, things like that. I can use these treble hooked hard baits to catch fish, you know, around rock or wood cover, anything like that. The very first one that I want to mention is a whopper plopper style bait. This is actually, you know, the river to sea whopper plopper. Generally not fishing the real big one. This is the 110 version. I think that this is a really good size for fishing from the bank. The great thing about a whopper plopper is that it creates a ton of noise, and a lot of the ponds that you're going to be fishing, you know, from the bank are, you know, sometimes they're a little bit dirtier, a little bit dingier, and having a bait that creates a lot of commotion can be you know, a big benefit to you. And so whopper ploppers are really a good choice for fishing these ponds, especially when it's warmer weather. The topwater baits that I'm showing you right now generally are the spawn forward, but you can catch them all throughout the year on top in small ponds, but generally you're talking about warmer weather from after they spawn all the way through, you know, to the end of fall. But yeah, the whopper plopper is really good. All you have to do is just cast it out around cover. You don't want to get it right in the middle of cover, but if you're like casting on the edge of maybe some reeds on the bank, or you're casting down the side of a lay down, anything like that, a whopper plopper is going to get some vicious strikes. So make sure you're using pretty heavy tackle with this technique. I like to throw it with braid. You can throw it with heavy monofilament too. That's another good line choice, you know, 20-pound test monofilament, but really easy to use. You just cast it out and reel it back. It's very simple. The next bait, which is one that you can really manipulate the way that you fish it, but is also another really good, you know, bank fishing topwater, is like a popper. Okay, this one is a Strike King popper, and the reason why a popper is so good is because usually when you're fishing from the bank on these small ponds, the primary forage is going to be bluegill, okay? And a popper is one of the best bluegill imitations out there. You know, it actually sounds like a bluegill popping on the surface, and it's about the same size as your small little pumpkin seed or small, you know, bluegill. You know, it's just a really, really good presentation to imitate that type of forage. And so a popper also is really neat because it stays in a strike zone for longer. It's one of the topwater baits that can really just stay in the strike zone. What I mean by that is that if you cast it by, say, you know, a stick up, there's a little stick sticking out of the water. You cast it there, you can work it right next to that stick for a very, very long time. You can do it indefinitely if you have the patience. But you essentially how I fish this on small ponds or fishing from the bank is I will find, you know, isolated cover, whether it's that stick up that's just sticking out in the middle of nowhere, or maybe it's like a point in the grass on the shoreline, or the edge of like a willow tree that's hanging down. Whatever type of cover that you can find, isolated cover, you cast this popper over to that cover, to the side of it. You don't want to get it in the cover because the treble hooks, and you just pop it, you know, try to walk it from side to side, you know, give it those short, sharp little pops with the rod tip, and try to make this thing go side to side, but not move forward that much. So it's kind of it's kind of like fishing a jerkbait, where you're just slapping a little bit of slack out of the line, and that's going to allow this bait to just move side to side and not move forward that much, which is what you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to put this where you think a fish may be hanging next to some cover, and then just kind of work it slowly in place. Now, when I'm fishing from my boat, I generally tend to fish it a little bit faster, but from the bank, you know, I'm making a cast at specific targets, and I want it to stay in those areas. So popper, you know, just worked side to side, or just popped, you know, once, let the ripples settle, and then pop it again, or two pops. You find the cadence that the fish want on any given day. You can fish it as slow as you want or as fast as you want. Just kind of experiment with it. But a popper is definitely one of the absolute best bank fishing hard baits out there, because you can keep it in the strike zone long, or you can move it along pretty quick. The last bait, again, another topwater, but this one right here is going to be a really big player for people that are fishing, you know, more lakes with more vegetation, whether that's, you know, reed lines just along the shoreline, or, you know, there's some grass lines, some lily pads, whatever it is. This right here is called the Lane Changer 150. Okay, this is another River to Sea topwater. Not sponsored by River to Sea, but I like a lot of their baits. A lot of the reason why I like them is because they usually have pretty heavy duty you know, components to it, so you can fish it around some pretty heavy duty stuff and for big fish. And so this category is of prop baits. You know, this one has two props. This is kind of designed after the old Devil's Horse, which is a very, very popular bait, especially down in Florida, but in grass lakes around the country. And the reason why I like throwing this around grass is because, like the popper, it can stay in the strike zone for a long period of time and still get strikes. But specifically for the prop baits like this and this Lane Changer, I like to throw it on grass lines. So like I mentioned, you know, fishing the edge of grass that's growing right on the bank, or, you know, cast into like a point in some lily pads off the bank, whatever type of edges you're talking about. And it can be worked just around like laydowns or something like that in shallow water too. But vegetation is really where this shines. you're essentially, it doesn't have any side-to-side, you know, walking action. This type of bait is made to just be kind of ripped forward. So it'll go straight, it'll spit and sputter because of those two blades. And so you just kind of work it like 1.5 feet, let it sit, let all the ripples kind of go, and then you do the same thing. You're just kind of occasionally just ripping it forward about 1 foot, 1.5 feet, and then letting it settle. And fishing a bait like that on the edge of grass, just, I don't know why grass fish really love this type of bait, you know, Florida fish, you know, but it really calls them out of that grass. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that these blades aren't creating like a crazy amount of commotion like you'd expect from, you know, a you know, whopper plopper or a buzzbait or something like that, but it's that very subtle spitting and sputtering that I think imitates a small group of those type of bait fish you just constantly see swimming along the side of you know, the edges of grass or something like that. It's just a little bit different. You know, it's not as bold of a sound or an action in general, but this type of bait can do very, very well, especially if you're fishing on grass lakes from the bank. And just make sure that you're using heavier tackle. Use a topwater like this, like the lane changer, that kind of supports heavier components, heavier treble hooks, all those sort of things, heavier wires, and you can wrench fish out of that heavy cover from the bank, because you can't go in after them in most situations from fishing from the bank. So you want something that has a lot of you know, premium heavy duty components to it, so you can rip those fish out or just get it unsnagged from the grass. But anyways, I know some of these choices are kind of from left field, but these are the baits that I really have always loved throwing from the bank. And again, when it comes to hard baits aren't necessarily my first choice fishing from the bank, but if you're in a situation where you've got not like matted out grass, or you've got a lot of wood and rock cover, these actually may be some of the best choices for you in those scenarios. But anyways, guys, I'm going to put as many of these as I can in the description below as far as links, because you can get 10% off of your order with 44 tackle. So I'm going to go ahead and put some links below, and I also get a little bit of a kickback if you use those links to buy these products. But anyways, guys, hopefully this answers Robert's question to the best that I can. You know, go out there, have a good time fishing off the bank, try all different types of baits, but definitely don't forget these hard baits that I mentioned today. So thank you guys for watching. Make sure you like, share, subscribe. I'm going to see you out on the water or on the bank.